There was a young feminist activist who thought, "We can change the world if we work together. If the walls of Jericho can come tumbling down, so can the walls of patriarchy." We sang songs. We created new songs. Some of us rediscovered goddess wisdom, others created non-competitive games and ways of organizing. Do you remember your first early dreams as a little girl about what you would do when you grew up? And the first time a boy laughed and taunted, "Girls can't do that, that's what boys do." Do you remember your early feminist dreams of a better world? I remember and treasure young feminist energy sharing dreams. At conferences, we slipped away to welcoming rocking chairs overlooking the peaceful lake. When we are old, there will be no more men telling us what we can't do, and we'll turn this retreat center into a fabulous feminist retirement home and tell our stories of transformation, creativity, and injustice upended. Our vision expanded, especially as we listened to each woman who entered the circle. Nell Morton called it hearing women to speech. Nell Morton, early feminist theologian, shared a practice of believing there was a story in each woman of self-worth, dreams, and potential that would find coherence and voice if we sat in circles and listened. Listening one another into speech. Picture the triangle that exists in a circle as we listen deeply to women's stories. Paying attention activates dreams, wakes up self-worth, and animates potential. Listening activates creativity, like songs for Central American solidarity, and art conveying barriers excluding persons living with physical challenges. Deep listening in community sparked a transformation, like the caterpillar chrysalis yielding a new creation. Through academic achievements and strategy setbacks, we created sacred space in community, expanding commitment and breaking open deeper understandings as we left a trail documenting our dreams and stories. Analysis came so quickly in those early feminist years. Looking back, we dreamed so grandly, missed so much, and though we persisted, the toll of patriarchy decade by decade reveals murdered and missing Indigenous women, our environment scarred, extreme poverty, and always racism. We were busy changing the world, claiming every profession and trade, clearing the way for all women daring their talents and attempting all those things that only boys can do. Always learning, realizing that binary language limited, views of success were limited. We questioned everything, answering boldly and listening some more. We persisted, we achieved, yet did our efforts create systemic change? And then there was this past year, all that this year brought. What changes happened in your life? How did life circumstances change your opportunities and dreams? How are you, right now, this International Women's Day, after a year of sacred shelter and now time to think about venturing into transformed time and space? We could emerge from this time of sheltering much stronger together. Illusions which shattered our seclusion this past year can help us demystify systemic oppression and rekindle dreams. Outrageous acts of violence disrupted the vulnerability experienced during shelter in place. In Nova Scotia, the initial reports of shooting, burning, and rampage described the white male suspect as such a nice guy. Early reporting from the CBC interviewed a woman from the Canadian Femicide Observatory for Justice and Accountability, naming ongoing domestic abuse, and reporters interviewed a neighbor who had moved across the country from one of the houses torched because she had feared him so much. But the RCMP commissioner could not say the word femicide, and reporting dried up, as has detailed reporting of increased domestic partner and child abuse. We claim sacred space and become stronger together as we boldly name the terror and violence that misogyny tries to normalize. Violent rage is not normal and requires demystifying skills to bring us together to take action. Confused and overwhelmed, we too want to look away. But clear-headed, magnified by calm, and fortified by community, we act with confidence, acting in the urgent moment and laying out a long-term strategy. Media, laws, policing making it criminally costly to harm women, strengthening all organizations in our communities, creating safety nets where danger exists, and changing conditions so women, children, and families can thrive. Demystifying misogyny makes it impossible for all branches of government, community agencies, and faith communities to shrug and look away. We demystify misogyny as we listen deeply to our stories and hear ourselves to speech and hold our gaze. By demystify, I mean asking, why? Why does violence against women continue? Really, how many laws, systems, organizations, policies, and attitudes must change to end systemic sexism? The pandemic revealed how unsafe and stained our public sacred space is for women. A second outrageous injustice made visible was the knee to the neck that killed George Floyd, whose hands were already shackled. So many killings of men and women and youth by police, continuing protests. But this time we were at home and watched what we didn't want to believe. Some went to the streets to protest, while many who stayed home were one with the protesters, together pondering why, after all the years of working for racial justice, we're in this crisis now. What is systemic racism? Who has a vested interest in white supremacy? What is white privilege? Finally, settler Canadians acknowledge this isn't just a problem in the U.S. Now is also the time to demystify racism. By demystify, I mean asking, why? Why does systemic racism continue? Really, how many laws, systems, organizations, policies, and attitudes must change? The pandemic revealed how unsafe and stained our public sacred space is for Black and Indigenous peoples of color. If effort were all it took to create change, we would be in a different place. The Nova Scotia mass killing and numerous police killings were so public at a time of such vulnerability, it was as though we were again in a circle, in our rocking chairs, listening deeply to these stories that wanted to be heard to speech. Perhaps pandemic stories are activating our deep belief in the inherent dignity and worth of people in a new way, renewing our dreams of ending oppression and rekindling deeper understanding of systemic forces that subjugate, enslave, and colonize humans. While many, many white people recognize racism and sexism as an injustice, what supports the effort required to understand what maintains that injustice? Privilege puts us on the on-ramp to better education, better paying jobs, living in comfortable, sacred spaces. Can comfortable, compassionate, privileged, principled people demystify systemic sexism and racism and explore decolonization? An apparently scary word for folks with privilege is decolonization. Let's demystify 3 scary words: privilege, colonization, and decolonization. Decolonizing our minds takes these scary words in a story and by taking us on a journey helps discover how to conquer our fears. That's why many adults really love good children's books. Watching the street protests, the not young anymore feminist asked, why is the focus on policing? The sustained protest defied pandemic insistence to stay home. Sacred space was created on the streets as the protest focused on criminally charging and defunding the police. But of all the urgent issues, housing, education, low wages, why the focus on policing, and is defunding a wise strategy? The question opened understanding of white privilege. What a white woman thinks based on a fairly benign experience with policing is clearly not what is important or remotely relative to those being killed. Thinking that the job of policing is to protect me is one of so many examples of taking it so for granted that I don't even have to think about it white privilege. Protesters broke through media spin and demystified the historical connection of policing as integral to the enforcement of slavery. The knee to the neck was of a black man on the ground already subdued by shackles, replicating enforcement of slavery. Who gave authority for enslavement and the policing necessary for enforcement? Witnessing that 9.5-minute horrific footage transports us to Africa and the Slavery Museum of Angola. One room forces you to see together the shackles, the branding iron, the baptismal font, and the window out to the sea where human beings were bound, branded, and baptized and boarded on ships for the Americas. In Africa, the slave trade is depicted by a map with a triangle in the Atlantic Ocean. One point is the place where the dehumanizing journey of chattel slavery begins with capture and confinement. Name this country, and the other 2 points in the triangle will likely still share the same language 5 centuries later. In Angola, the points of connection are Portugal in Europe and Brazil in South America. England to Sierra Leone to the cotton fields of the U.S. make another triangle, and the cotton is processed in the mills of England and ships transport cloth to Africa for more slaves. The slave trade triangle is extremely important to Africa because it points to Europe as the location of the authority giver for enslavement and colonization. Between 1452 and 1493, a series of papal bulls gave authority to claim humans as slaves, subjugate the wisdom and bodies of women, and colonize lands not already claimed by Christian monarchy. European monarchies would rule and extract the resources for wealth development of Africa and the Americas for centuries. When Columbus returned with his discovery of lands with potential great wealth, the king and queen oversaw the political and enforcement authority to take whatever was found in these lands and the right to claim and colonize for the crown. The papal authority was just as pernicious. It claimed that any peoples who were not baptized Christians could be subjugated and enslaved, and that any people encountered in the newly discovered land who were not ruled by Christian monarchs were not owners of the land or resources. When we demystify the doctrine of discovery, we learn it means the land was vacant, or terra nullius, of persons with worth and dignity. And that kind of discovery means you own it when you step on it. Through centuries of exploitation, the dreams of liberation have always found voice. It is indeed the inextinguishable interdependent dream we all share, and a powerful few thwart. Of all the ideas we could explore for our International Women's Day service, why are we talking about kings, queens, and popes who lived 500 years ago? If we hear the story as one of enduring systemic injustice because moral authority and governmental authority power linked their power, it's not so scary, and we can go on a journey of discovery to renew our dreams, reclaim our dignity, and create a new story for our planet. We decolonize our minds as we examine if our government is still structured so that the wealthy few disproportionately benefit while the rest fight each other for the leftovers. We examine what sustains the immoral authority today that supports sexism, racism, and heterosexism. Theology and the church are not irrelevant. Rather, we unravel and debunk what set oppression in motion. The glue of oppression is the consolidation of governing power with moral power. We recognize immediately when someone speaks truth to power. If we don't understand white privilege, it is almost impossible to consider decolonization. If we think moral authority is a quaint, meaningless phrase, it's almost impossible to consider decolonization as an ethical, principled process for justice, right relation, and reallocation of resources to help everyone flourish. Decolonizing the mind helps people of conscience to find voice and take action for change with moral authority. Our principles are not platitudes. Our dreams are not pie in the sky. They are the moral authority to undo the unholy injustice. We can hold clearly the intersectionality of oppressions and insist that those legislating, policing, creating programs, teaching clearly can say femicide, misogyny, systemic racism, colonization, and white privilege. We can say the names of injustice and learn how to undo the systems of damage and enforcement of such isms. Decolonizing the mind is a tool of survival for folks in solitary confinement and pandemics. It is also a devotional practice sustaining communities of liberation. Now an old woman, the once young feminist sits in her rocking chair. How do we create sacred space when our lives have been turned upside down? Rising from this question is an aching, haunting inquiry. To what am I devoted? Dreams, demystifying, and decolonizing take us to the threshold. What dreams have grown in this fertile, sacred space-time, where old dreams and demystifying, searching for deeper truth occur? When feeling alone, fearful, and isolated, peeling away illusions and acknowledging the power of systemic isms risks retreat and abandoning the future. With strong community, with virtual companions, inner devotion carries us over the threshold to a new future with a fresh, realistic, and visionary gaze. This year, the Canadian Unitarian Universalist Women's Association offered monthly Zoom book conversation and a Zoom Cakes for the Queen of Heaven exploration. We are creating many strong communities with virtual companions. Decolonizing can feel daunting. Privilege isn't scary when we retell the story, though. When decolonization is framed as, what will be lost and what do I have to give up, fear is activated. Fear puts devotion in bondage. The fear part of the brain knows, freeze, flee, or fight. Fear turns our principles into platitudes instead of plans for action. None of these responses are particularly useful devotional practices. When we begin decolonizing our mind, our dreams, and our visions of the future, the threshold opens to devoting our lives as practices creating sacred space for everyone. For some, the end of the pandemic is when we go back to life as we knew it. The early pandemic solution, stay home and do nothing, opened options like rocking chair activism when outrageous injustices occurred. Just as easily, rocking chair activists opened Zoom for meditation groups, sharing circles, and celebrations. Sorry, we don't have all the answers yet. We're still learning to defrag the colonized mind and do deferred learning. We continue gathering diverse, intersectional, creative virtual communities that are committed to dreaming, demystifying, decolonizing, and devoting. Sacred space holds and sustains us on a journey. It includes some not yet knowing. This pandemic time has offered us novel and unexpected tools. It turns out that dream of the rocking chair gathering space of the feminist retirement home is a virtual Zoom room. Friends of decades are meeting by Zoom every month, remembering, reclaiming, and reframing the dreams. And it turns out that young feminists actually believed we would end a lot of sexism, racism, heterosexism, but didn't believe we would grow old. And yet, here we are, years later, once again pulling our rocking chairs into a circle on Zoom. Who could imagine how the pandemic would reveal the online community of multi-generational, intersectional, bold, and profound activists? Dreams we couldn't even imagine are being realized in our midst. Devotion could mean deep listening to stories of demystifying, debunking, and decolonizing work available online for study and consideration. Devotion can mean donating to younger feminist activists, artists, and dreamers. Rocking chair activism can include marches online, donation online, learning, encouraging, stargazing, strategizing, meditating, and celebrating in new ways. There are many ways to be devoted. As we draw our chairs into the circle of Zoom rooms, may we remember all of our foremothers, who, like Nell Morton, gave us gifts that work as well for Zoom as it did when we could sit on the floor in a circle. Listen. Listen to each woman, each person experiencing oppression, and each person who is aching to live into dignity and recognize the worth, call forth dreams, and encourage learning and changing and creating. Please take advantage of this International Women's Day to pause and reflect on what this year has meant to you. Congratulate yourself for the ways you have met many challenges, the ways you have helped others, and gratitude for those who have helped you. Not everyone is called to be an activist. If you are exhausted and struggling, grieving and alone, please reach out for support. Devotion may be inviting you to renewed commitment to your well-being and finding support you need. Devotion may be inviting you to a season of stillness, pondering, and feeling held by the rocking chair. While many dreams dimmed, the power of hearing one another to speech is just as powerful today. Friends that stick with us to the end of the world and back, formed in listening circles and rocking chairs, endure.